Hi, everybody, and thanks so much for being here tonight. My name is Kyle Dancewicz. I'm the Deputy Director of Sculpture Center. I'm really happy to have you here on the occasion of this talk. I'll also mention that we're seated in the middle of an exhibition that's currently on view, and thank you for taking part in it by sitting in these chairs, which all have a very specific political meaning. This is Henrika Naumann's first exhibition in the United States, an artist coming from Germany. So we're really happy to host this conversation in the midst of this exhibition in particular. It's in some ways a great pairing, in some ways a very strange pairing. But very happy to be collaborating with the Woodman Family Foundation and the support staff of the David Kordansky Gallery, with whom the foundation is working now to focus on this period in Betty Woodman's life. I want to thank you to Maya Asak, Camila Nichols, and Julie Nemi from the gallery for their support in preparing the conversation. The exhibition that is at Kordansky right now is a very beautiful show that's called Betty Woodman, Conversations on the Shore, works from the 1990s. And as an organization that's committed to developments in sculpture for almost 100 years, Sculpture Center is really pleased to facilitate a deeper conversation on just one period of Betty Woodman's work, which of course was both subjected to and constantly transforming an ongoing conversation about clay, craft, and fine art over the decades in which she was making work. I'm here to facilitate the conversation between two people who are much more intimately engaged with Betty Woodman's work. First is Judith Tannenbaum. Judith Tannenbaum is a contemporary art curator who has organized numerous exhibitions of painting, sculpture, video, and interdisciplinary work. She's particularly interested in the relationship between visual and art and performance, and how fine art, craft, and design intersect. She held senior positions at the Institute of Contemporary Art, University of Pennsylvania, from 1986 to 2000, and was the Richard Brown Baker Curator of Contemporary Art at the RISD Museum from 2000 to 2013. Recent projects include Whitman at 200, Art and Democracy, and A New View Camden, 2021. She is currently project curator for Rising Sun, Artists in an Uncertain America, which opens at the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in March 2023. A board member of the Woodman Family Foundation since 2003, Tannenbaum met Betty and George Woodman in the mid-1980s. She organized exhibitions of Woodman's work at the ICA Philadelphia and the RISD Museum. Amy Sherlock is a writer, curator, and features editor of The World of Interiors, based in London. Between 2011 and 2021, she was the deputy editor of Frieze magazine, and between 2016 to 19, she curated the annual Frieze Art and Architecture Conference, which explored, amongst other things, how art exists in the domestic sphere. She's written extensively about the relationship between fine and decorative arts, with a particular emphasis on ceramics and textiles, and their changing status over the course of 20th century art history. In 2016, she interviewed Betty Woodman ahead of Woodman's first institutional solo presentation in the UK at the age of 76, a formative conversation to which she has made reference in numerous subsequent pieces, including a recent essay for the Catalogue for Strange Clay, a major ceramics exhibition currently on display at London's Hayward Gallery. Thank you both so much for being here. We'll start with two presentations by Judith and by Amy, and then open the conversation.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Is the mic okay? Okay, let me know or wave if it's a problem. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I get to meet Amy, and I feel like we have a whole new little family in the room. But it's a wonderful event to be here this evening, so thank you very much. Okay, as you mentioned, I met Betty Woodman in the early 1980s, not long after she and her husband George moved to a loft in New York. At the time, they were also teaching at the University of Colorado in Boulder and spending summers in Italy. I didn't know much about ceramics at the time, although I had always been attracted to it. I was immediately impressed by the ingenuity of Woodman's forms and the vitality of her glazed surfaces, and of course by the dynamism and intelligence of the woman herself. A couple of years later, I organized an exhibition of Betty's work for the Friedman Gallery at Albright College in Reading, Pennsylvania, a small university-related gallery, and produced a small catalog for the show. Together, we selected and edited the works to be shown and figured out how to present the objects to their best advantage, painting the pedestals so that the top surfaces would seem to float and the bases disappear. I was struck over and over again by how many ideas are embedded in every Woodman pot, vase, platter, tray, or pitcher. At that time in the mid-'80s, Betty was beginning to reconstruct her vessels. Handles became detached from the body of the vase. Miraculously, her forms multiplied into two-sided diptychs and triptychs, in which the front and back are equally striking. She created vases with their separate shadows and three-dimensional forms that were simultaneously flat and pictorial representations of themselves. So I'm sure if you've already seen the show at the gallery, or if when you do, you'll see that a lot of those ideas that she was working on in the 80s carried into the 90s in the works currently on view at Kordansky. In 1992, shift here, when the National Conference of Ceramic Artists was held in Philadelphia, I invited Betty to show at the ICA. Only a couple of years before, I had been told in no uncertain terms by the then director that the ICA did not show ceramics or other craft-related work. So thank goodness that's changed somewhat. What you see now is an installation she did in 1988 called Somewhere Between Naples and Denver, and it was done at the Denver Art Museum. And I'll show you a reference slide for that too in a minute. And then we reconfigured the show and added to it in Philadelphia in 1992. And Betty created a large balustrade vase piece, which you see on that center wall. So that was a new piece that she made to complement the installation. And that's her husband, George, posing there. And I'll show you the source image for this. It's quite amazing. I had not actually seen this until recently. So for the Denver installation, she riffed off of this 18th century cloister of the Church of Santa Chiara in Naples. A faceted column with spiraling vines and a full-scale bench on which visitors can rest are drawn directly from the Rococo Neapolitan courtyard. But let's see if I go back. You can see that everything was obviously made by the artist, and she has made it her own. So you see even this like lattice work on the bottom, and then certainly the pillars with the vines twined around them. In 1993, Betty created Il Giardino dipinto, another very ambitious multi-part installation that uses the wall as an integral element of the composition. That's Betty in the center. Here we see the artist in the middle of the piece. I believe this was from the installation in Paris at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs. There's something like 60 pieces that make up the composition. And the wall is about 3 meters or 30 feet long. And this one was inspired by the House of the Golden Bracelet in Pompeii. Part of that fresco, it's also a much more elaborate installation, and there are several rooms. But it was sent to Florence for restoration, and Betty and George lived outside of Florence in a small town called Antella. So she actually saw this piece when it was on view in Florence, and that was the inspiration for her own garden. And then I'll show you, this is another extraordinary Roman fresco cycle that Betty took me to see. In Rome, in 2012, we did a day trip from Florence. It's called Livia's Garden, and it should be better known than it is. It's in a public museum in Rome, right near the train station, and I must say that it's really one of my very most favorite museum experiences, and I've lived quite a few years, so this is right at the top. So I got to revisit it just this past fall. I was fortunate. I went to to Venice and to Rome, and went back to see it, and it doesn't disappoint. You can actually, they have identified 23 plants and 69 bird species. It's completely enclosed, and the composition is very symmetrical. And you can note here there are two fences layering. There's the one that's sort of the tannish ochre natural color, and then there's a grassy area, and then you see a white fence as well. So there's this movement in space that the artists were doing. This dates from, well, we have it on the screen, 40 to 20 BC. So I think it's supposedly the earliest garden painting of its type. And this is a detail that I took, so I apologize for the photography, but you can get to see the detail in this. And clearly it was a favorite of Betty's. I think that every time she went, not every time she went to Rome, but many times that she would look at this particular installation. Okay, and this is a view of Betty's Il Giardino dipinto, the same one that we saw in the Paris installation. And I brought it to RISD, the RISD Museum, where I was the curator of contemporary art, for an exhibition in 2005, and the piece was gifted to the RISD Museum. So I don't know that it's been on view since it takes up this 30-plus foot wall. But we also asked Betty to go into storage, and particularly ceramics and glass storage, and to choose works from the collection that would have resonance with her own work. So in the foreground here, you can see several fairly large folk pots. I think those are probably, at least the one in the front, I think is 19th century. The range, though, that she chose, I think let's see if I have, whoops, I'll stay on that for a minute. The objects that she chose range from 7th century BC Greek oil bottles and storage jars to 19th century folk art, folk pots, and Venetian glass pieces. And the Venetian ones were interesting because they copied or riffed on ancient forms and decorations, so she's going through history. And this is, in an adjoining gallery, we showed a group of drawings, and most people really haven't seen many of Betty's drawings, but they're really quite fabulous. They have this very open and grand gestural quality. She was going to do a residency in Bellagio, and so she made quite a large series of this type of drawing, and she used it's a liquid clay, terra sigillata, to actually paint on the surface to create that sort of the neutral tones that you see, the vase in the top left and on the top right again are terra sigillata. So they're fairly fragile, I think, because it dries and can crack. But the scale of these is, this one is 57 by 73, so they're really quite imposing, ambitious. Okay, Betty loved looking at art, from ancient to modern and contemporary, and from many different cultures, periods, and parts of the world. I spent many hours with her at galleries and museums, and her interest and capacity to absorb art never flagged. She also loved working in the studio and was always excited about her latest piece. She also swam or ran 4 or 5 days a week into her 80s, so she was really quite a phenomenal person. Okay, and here on this slide you see 2 museum cases. The one on the left is the selections that she made at the RISD Museum, and the one on the right are her own Etruscan pots that must have been inspired by her early travels in Italy. And I think that Amy will be showing a couple of those so you'll see them more up close. But I love the way that the cases are so closely related also. So there's a certain thing about museums at a certain point in time. But Betty, when she came to RISD to choose these things, it was such a joy. It's like going shopping, really. she couldn't get enough. I guess with the Etruscan ones, I'd just say that I love the way she absorbed historic forms and transformed them into something distinctly contemporary. I'd like to end with a few slides of my photographs that I took of Betty, and not just of Betty, but of things in her environment. And she lived, after Betty and George retired from Boulder, they lived 6 months a year in Antella, Italy, and 6 months a year in New York. So this is where people would have breakfast every morning with this gorgeous view into, if you continue past the vista, you can actually, on a clear day, can actually see the Duomo in Florence. This is Betty's friend Kiki Smith, and it was wonderful to eat in this glorious place and to have homemade yogurt, which is in the foreground, and eat off of Betty's dishes and cups. Okay, and for many years, at least, I visited several times in Antella, and they had pet doves, so the doves after would feast on the leftover bread. And they made, they coo. They make these wonderful noises, so I'm sorry you don't have the total atmosphere. And Betty was a fabulous cook. Anybody who had the opportunity to have a meal at home was privileged. And she actually cooked with the same kind of skill and ease. She prepared food in the same way that the fluidity with which she created her ambitious and groundbreaking ceramics. Both activities may seem effortless, but we know how much preparation, hard work, and thought they required. These are stuffed peppers on one of her platters. Let's see. This is a shot that I took in her studio of her brushes, which she would adapt. And today, when I went back to see the exhibition of Kordansky, I could actually see where she had used, in particular the one on the left, where there were 3 different parts to the brush, so she could make continuous lines and create the movement of the lines in sync with each other, rather than trying to do these things parallel. And the last image that I have is Betty with her friend Pat Steer, a wonderful painter. And it was Betty's 80th birthday, and I think she was a little bit, I don't know what the right word would be, but the idea of turning 80 was, it was going too quickly, I think. And so Pat Steer and her husband actually made a lovely party for her, and I just like the way that they're posed, and the 2 Egyptian women seen from profile here. So I am going to end with that and just say how fortunate I feel to have had Betty for a friend for over 30 years. I know she would be thrilled about the show at Kordansky and to be the subject of tonight's program here at the Sculpture Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. That was a lovely presentation. I had the kind of pleasure and privilege of meeting Betty, obviously at a much later stage of her life and career. I think in my bio it said she was 76 when we met, but she was actually 85, and I think that one of the subjects that we might discuss is the fact that Betty had to wait till quite late in her life to receive recognition as an artist, particularly internationally. As Kyle mentioned, I was interviewing her for 3 years in anticipation of her first ever solo institutional exhibition in the UK, which happened at the ICA in 2016, at the age of 85. And perhaps not unusually for many people my age, I had initially come to Betty's work through the photographs of her daughter Francesca. I had written an academic paper about Francesca as part of my undergraduate studies, and I had kind of seen images of Betty's work, and I was immediately kind of enraptured. And when I went to find the works in real life in London, the place that they are in London is the Victoria and Albert Museum, which I'm sure, as many of you know, is the world's largest collection of decorative and applied arts, amongst many other things. But it was set up partly as a kind of reference museum for makers and manufacturers. So a very different context to the way that I had been introduced to Francesca's work, which was in a kind of prominent commercial gallery. And I think that that says something quite indicative about the comparative statuses of ceramics as opposed to photography in the art world of that time, which was the kind of around 2010, I suppose. The other thing that was going on in London when I met Betty was all of a sudden, all of my friends who were artists were making things in clay. It was, not having trained in that medium, but there was like a kind of moment of experimentation where like every single show in East London was like kind of wonky ceramics. And I had been writing about that kind of trend, if you want to call it that, for Frieze, or as an editor at the time. And trying to kind of place those practices in, I guess, an art historical lineage that I saw as being very connected to what was happening on the West Coast in the 50s and 60s, kind of California clay movement that kind of revolved around Pete Volkos and the people that had been his students and assistants at Otis, so people like Ken Price and Ron Nagel, who obviously continue to have great commercial and critical success. And that California clay was kind of important in my thinking because it was a moment at which clay really crossed over and it was considered an artistic material without needing kind of explanation, I think. And that transition, I guess, away from a material-focused kind of craft discourse around making and the kind of the idea of the well-made pot to a kind of conceptual and critical engagement with the art object was very, very much kind of informed the ways of talking about working with clay, the kind of conversations that I was having with my peers. And Betty, I think, is obviously deeply involved and kind of implicated in this movement away from clay, kind of away from the applied sphere and into the kind of sculptural realm. But she, I feel, always kind of engaged with that on her own terms. And I wanted to kind of give a slight counterpoint to Judith's presentation by focusing on the fact that Betty always made vessels right until the very end. I would say that the kind of vessel form was her primary and most kind of salient, both material and idea, which, obviously had a lot to do with her training. She was educated, or she had a kind of, the basis of her ceramic practice were studies in the late 1940s at the School of American Craftsmen, at that time based at Alfred University, which was a small, non-academic, non-degree awarding educational institution that had been set up by Eileen Osborne Webb, who, as I guess many of you may know, is the kind of perhaps the most significant supporter of American craft in the 20th century, who'd also set up Craft Horizons magazine and the American Craft Council, and also America House, which was a kind of retail space where makers, including the students of the School for American Craftsmen, could sell their wares. So the first objects that Betty went into production with, she recounts, were ramekins, custard cups that she sold in sets of 6 for something. I think it was like $2 for 6. They were in 3 different colors. And that the pricing of that was also something that that was part of the education at the school. So she came from a kind of applied production pottery background. And I don't think it was actually until much later, I guess kind of maybe the time that you first encountered Betty, Judith, where she really began to think and talk about herself as an artist rather than a potter. In the back of the book that was made for the Met show in 2006, there's a chronology, and there are kind of two entries a decade apart, which I found quite kind of pertinent. In 1973, there's like a very short statement that says, "Very happy to be included in Objects for the Preparation of Food at the American Craft Museum." And then a decade later, in 1983, it's join Max Protech Gallery, start to think of myself as an artist. And in that time, I guess, as you say, the Woodmans, at the insistence of Amy Golden, who is an important art critic at the time, had relocated at least part of the year to New York, and had become both George and Betty very affiliated with the artists in the pattern and decoration movement as it was kind of taking shape. So people like Joyce Kosloff, Bob Kushner, I know was a friend. And so there was this kind of milieu of artists that I would say in a joyful but in a serious way, were making a case for decorative and applied arts and all kinds of craft and artisanal production that had been hitherto marginalized or trivialized by the kind of dominant critical discourses. They were really asserting a place for that. And I guess I'm sure that kind of context was helped Betty was important in her kind of repositioning herself or reconceptualizing herself as someone that made artworks functional or not. And then there was the fact of joining Max Protech too, obviously a very established dealer who was working with people like Scott Burton, who I know was an influence on Betty, who was a sculptor, also a writer, but making basically functional furniture. So there's a whole kind of conversation there about what happens to an object when you take it out of a certain context. And so I think maybe from the 1980s, the early 1980s, is where you really begin to get these experimentations with the vessel form that are so kind of prominent in the exhibition at Kordansky. There's a quote that I went back through my notes, but I couldn't find, so I'm going to paraphrase, but she said something very interesting about the difference between a pot and a sculpture is, like, you don't have to think about where a pot lives, it kind of has its place, which is determined by what you're using it for, or your cupboard space. Whereas with a sculpture, you have to think about everything that goes round the sculpture. Being a sculptor, you're not just making objects, you're making a context for the objects. And so you start to have in the work these incredible, in fact, there it is right there, these incredible pots where the shadow is materialized, or the drop shadow of the shelf. She's thinking about what Scott Burton would call support objects. So you have the shelves coming out from the walls. There are, as Judith made reference to, these kind of paired sculptures where one is almost the inverse of the other. Questions of kind of frontality, where you have like a painted surface that's somehow attached to the vessel behind. And then increasingly these theatrical kind of mise en scène, where the pots are kind of staged against a painterly background. And that, I think, that kind of increasingly became a focus of the work in later years and remained a kind of question right till the end. We probably cycled through it already, but the last slide chronologically in the presentation is Summer House, which was a new work that Betty had produced for the show at the ICA, which I should say had come from the Museo Marino Marini in Florence, which is an enormous 4-panel work, which is essentially a painting showing very much under the kind of spell of Matisse and Bonnard, that shows an interior scene with a table looking out into the garden, and there are pots, but the painted pots have been cut out and are staged as the physical objects just in front of the screen. So you get, as with Livia's Garden Room, this kind of play of depth and trompe-l'oeil. But the vase is still there. And if I can just, I know I'm overrunning, so I apologize. But I do think that there's something about this kind of commitment to the vessel that goes beyond a purely kind of formal concern. And I think that her commitment to it also had to do with her belief in everyday beauty that goes right back to the kind of training really in this arts and crafts tradition of, if people live with beautiful objects that are made with care and craft, their lives will be better. And we don't talk very much about beauty in the art world these days for all kinds of reasons, many of which are very valid. But I do think that there it is, yeah. So you see, you have the kind of negative space where the pots have been cut out. But yeah, I think that was one of her enduring themes, and I feel like the kind of return again and again to these objects of use and also of serving and a certain kind of hospitality and generosity is very much implicated in that belief in the beauty of everyday objects.
Amazing. Judith, you mentioned something about Betty working on her own terms, or thinking about the status of ceramics and her approach to these installations on her own terms in the 90s. Maybe you could elaborate a bit more, or both of you could, on that particular period, especially around what you were saying about the restrictions you felt as a curator at the ICA. Just because I think it's helpful to get a bit of that context, then maybe to think about the specific choices and directions that Betty took as she was expanding kind of the scale to these room-size installations, and thinking about the other possibilities of ceramic and a language of installation art, maybe.
I had to really look back and see that she was doing these large architectural installations starting in the early 80s, which was really remarkable. And the first two, I think, happened because she lived outside of New York, which is interesting. I don't know that the same thing could have happened here. That the first one is the Aspen Room, and then the second one is the one that she did at the Denver Art Museum. So I think it probably was like a natural evolution in terms of her work. I think you kind of see that when you're just streaming through. I guess, because she was living in Italy, she had these amazing sources that she just ate up, really. Wherever she went, she would see these amazing environments. So something like I hadn't found that source image, the Rococo one from Naples. That's so different, and her style is so different, and yet she was taking very directly, which is pretty fascinating. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but I think what I see now in those architectural installations is that she has the vessels as the primary part on the shelves, breaks them up, deconstructs them, has them on the wall, and the spaces, the cutout spaces, are totally incorporated. So she's just created these amazingly ambitious installations, but just by doing them, I think. I mean, she wasn't as if she was saying, okay, I am carving out this particular place in time. But it is striking that when I was the curator at the IC, when I started out, and the director then, said absolutely not. I mean, that was just, we don't do that. And then, I think all things aren't equal now at all, but I think at least there's been a very different shift. Although I think what's interesting, what Amy, you were saying about a lot of the current ceramic work, is that it's very different from what Betty did and her training. And so to see some ceramics being accepted but in art galleries, but not necessarily by people who are trained in ceramics or know that much about it. So
I think there was this kind of funny exchange that so we were like, she was exhibiting the Aspen Garden Room at Freeze Masters, and we were like, I kind of interviewed her for the whole day, and we were kind of wandering around, and we had this funny exchange where I was saying, you know, I think that there's something about like disavowing the crap, you know, my friend Aaron Angel, who is now truly a kind of potter and runs a pottery, had just set up a kind of residency program for artists to come and experiment with clay, but the thing was no vessels. You know, he actually had like merch painted with kind of like a pot with a kind of cross through it. And there was something about like you had to disavow the craft. It had to be talking about something else that was not the material or the kind of mode of production. And that kind of, I've spent a lot of time writing and thinking about the kind of art-craft divide and the points at which it collapses, but it's still very much there, I think. And her point in response to this was like, well, why don't they just learn a bit, you know? And which I took, that was just a totally kind of valid response, that actually, if you know how to handle the material, you can push it to more. That was the thing about Pete Volkos, right? He was a very, very talented potter, and it was his skill and his dexterity and his understanding of the material that allowed him to take it somewhere totally else. And I think that was kind of Betty's feeling too. And when she talks, you know, about ceasing to consider herself as a potter at a certain moment, it's about like she's learned the craft of it, and that doesn't have to be the important thing anymore. You know, you learn the craft to kind of move beyond it. I have to say that the several of the prominent potters that were kind of in that position, amongst whom number Jessie Wine, who had an exhibition at Sculpture Centre here last year, the ones who've stayed in the medium have necessarily learned the craft. She was absolutely right in that regard.
One of the things that Betty told me is, I'm not sure, I started making pots myself probably about 16 years ago, maybe, when I was still in Rhode Island. So I can't remember if she said this to me when I wasn't making pots or when I was, but that ceramics is both two-dimensional and three-dimensional, that it, you know, have the two-dimensional surface of the pot and you have the three-dimensional volume of the form. And I think that's, for me, it just really stayed with me that this is something that is different about ceramics, perhaps.
And that's
and
something
as well as what it's made out of, you know.
And that's something that's so apparent in the exhibition right now, and in the way these works are functioning as sculpture and imagery and painting and installation, and have these really specific, almost like front-back relationships, perspectival relationships. In the ICA brochure that was accompanying your show, I'll read your own writing back to you, but this really wonderful passage, which is, because Woodman's ceramics seem so exuberant and effortless, the serious formal analysis which so discontinuity or division into parts requires often is overlooked. Yet this ability to make visible the art-making process and simultaneously underscore issues of perception itself without detracting from the stylistic and functional unity of the works has long been at the core of Woodman's works, and especially in her wall-mounted pieces. And I think bringing that idea of like what is the visuality of sculpture is a really important question that seems to occur over and over again. And maybe we could speak a bit about those functions and how you see them working, or how you think of them now, maybe. Say it again? Sure. Thinking about the nature of the sculptural installation, as well as this is a great example, you know, this kind of front-back relationship of the silhouetted form. The pots are often painted kind of into these trompe-l'oeil tableaux. And these are all these really interesting techniques that are perhaps like distinct to ceramic or distinct to uses of ceramic as both sculpture and kind of ornamental detail. And I don't know, maybe to speak a bit more about like those functions in the work, and, you know.
Well, you know, she was married to a painter, and that influence, those are kind of painterly concerns, right, about how you articulate space over kind of a two-dimensional surface. And I think that, in the beginning, George actually painted her pots. Some of the Etruscan vases that you were looking at on my loop were painted by him. He painted the pots until the 1970s, and then she had to kind of go, she went her own way. I think she said somewhere that it was either like the collaboration or the marriage, so she decided to save the marriage and paint her own pots. Very wise. But there's a whole, not just George, but there's a whole relationship to, as I was saying, to Matisse, to Bonnard, to modernist paintings, and a lot of the kind of those concerns about kind of perspective, I think, are very much color, obviously, implicated in that. But I just wanted to return, I wanted to try and answer your earlier question, Kyle, if I may be so bold. In terms of the room scale installation, I do think there is an important kind of connection there with the pattern and decoration artists. When they, if I'm not mistaken, when they first moved to New York, I think Betty shared a studio space with Joyce Kosloff, who was making tiles at the time. The Islamic galleries at the Met had opened in 1975, and that was a big kind of influence on the artists of the pattern and decoration group, including Joyce, who made basically a room-scaled installation with tiles that were kind of borrowing from this Islamic decorative lexicon. And I think that, there were other kind of artists, that group, that I think Betty says somewhere taught her to use the wall, and that again goes back to that point that the distinction she was making between the pot and the sculpture and thinking about everything around it. But I think that there were these kind of installations were being used, also performance in that group, creating environments to stage. Bob Kushner made a lot of textile works that were kind of catwalked in a way, and I think that thinking of the environment perhaps owes something to those exchanges at that moment in the kind of late 70s, early 80s.
I was struck in the slide that I showed with the two museum cases. So when we go to a traditional museum, we see pots frontally. I mean, that's the way we see them, even though they're three-dimensional objects. So I think as Betty moved along, though, and her pieces got larger, and she took them, they weren't in cases, but by doing the double-sided thing, she's showing the back and the front. The same with that. And I hadn't really thought about how do we, as just viewers, see these pieces. And so when you referred to when she shifted from calling herself a potter to an artist, a lot of that was about the presentation of the forms. And so as if she was a sculptor, then she's thinking much more about that aspect of it, is how is the work going to be shown, how is it going to be seen. But the pot's the pot. So, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And, whatever you call it, or the sculpture's the sculpture. So.
Maybe on that note, too, there's a couple of images that have been going through of the Max Protech Gallery installations and also some of her Stedelijk show. Maybe talking about those two, one gallery and one institution in particular in the 90s, and Betty's relationship with them would be an interesting next or context to explore.
So I found it very interesting that the Stedelijk had been the location of her first kind of major European show, because the Stedelijk is an institution that kind of already from the 60s had a reputation, and still does, for kind of showing very avant-garde practices. I mean, I could have, under kind of Willem Sandberg, going back to kind of Dilabi and all these very kind of experimental, big thematic exhibitions. and so that it had kind of landed there, I found, although obviously there, there's the kind of distill holdings there, and there is a kind of tradition of functional objects there. And I was very curious. I don't know, I actually was wondering whether, Judith, you knew any more about the kind of background to that institutional presentation.
I don't. No, there was a European show that had a European tour.
Yeah.
So it went to other museums there, but not here. So I don't know how she was approached or, how the interest developed.
And I think the connection to Max Protech, it was a director there that knew the work, the name.
Oh, it was Elsa Longhauser, actually,
exactly.
who, I knew Elsa. She was in Philadelphia, so I've overlapped with her, but she is the person who connected. She was working at Max's and connected Max with Betty.
And I think that the program was, he always kind of showed the work of also designers and architects also, right? So maybe it was kind of a natural fit, or it made sense in terms of that kind of applied dimension to the work. And I think that Scott Burton was not so much formally, obviously, an influence, because they were doing very different things, but he actually curated the first, artist choice room at MoMA in '89, and he installed these Brancusi works, some of them just the plinths. He had a real thing for the plinth that Brancusi put his sculptures on, and he installed some of them without the kind of works. And I think that thinking, that idea of the kind of supporting object, the kind of functional object as also an aesthetic decision, an aesthetic practice in itself. I don't know, I definitely see it feeding into the way that Betty's work comes to be kind of presented, and later on in the 80s and onwards.
And maybe we could also take a moment to speak a bit more about those larger installation pieces. In particular, we've touched on it a little bit, but thinking about the decorative motifs that are used as sculptural installations, moving toward the walls, which was a really kind of nice thing that came up earlier too, and maybe how Betty self-conceptualized as she was producing those works and making those kinds of translations. And I don't know, and any notes on the reception of those too would be quite interesting to hear, as it seems like quite a kind of turning point.
I don't know about the reception.
I was just wondering when the actual balustrade was installed in Denver in the airport, because there's a obverse of some of these kind of balustrade pieces where she's taking architectonic elements and flattening them, which you kind of see here, because she was commissioned to do a public commission that took many years, I think.
I think it's later. We're gonna.
Where she actually, in the kind of reverse operation, she makes a balustrade out of pots, basically.
I think it's earlier than I thought it was.
Thank you.
So we'll just look. We'll keep talking, and then we'll go.
Is that still installed there?
Yeah.
It is. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I don't think I've never seen it.
I've never seen it, only in pictures.
I mean, to me, what's mind-boggling is how she figured out how to, just these compositions. They're just so complicated, really, and yet they're so fluid at the same time. There's nothing, there's no tension in it.
Yeah.
and it's interesting to follow some of them too, over the many years, because there is a kind of like iterative element to some of the work as well, where some motifs appear or are adapted, or certain silhouettes appear again over time too. And thinking about, there's those examples of the ceramic pieces that have the kind of winged figure coming off of them, which then appear in these kind of other forms later on too. I don't know, I feel like that's something that's so like interesting to think through too, is like the invention and iterativeness at the same time. And perhaps this is also something that's quite specific to her approach and to the kind of ceramic vessel itself too.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of kind of play with those elements that are somehow that are central to the picture. We should talk about like more specifically, because she talked about the kind of picture as the almost the kind of ceramic form that occurs certainly in kind of basically every culture has a picture, and I think there are certain elements of that, the handle, the kind of spout, that recur again and again. And she was really a student of all kinds of ceramic tradition, and I think that maybe feeds into it as well. In a way, there's a kind of mimetic response to the way that you get all of these, that handles recur throughout history, or the certain curve of kind of an amphora or a kind of spout. And she's not just taking, we talked about the kind of decorative elements, the balustrade or the shelf, but architectonic ones, but she's also kind of taking the basic elements of what makes a pot, and kind of repeating them and exaggerating them, but coming back to them again and again.
I think with the pictures, her famous the pillow picture, and it's interesting though, because she started those when, is that 70s even, or?
I think the first one is like 75, but
Okay.
she'd been making the
But
erotic
then she-
burritos before then, which were like the
Right.
proto pillow pictures.
But with the pillow pictures, the way they were really different was the surface decoration, which would be from a different culture. So you had the Tang one, and then you would have, an Asian one, and so it wasn't so much, and that form that she continued to do into the 2000s.
Yeah.
So, in one way, I think she felt that she was too well known for them, and so she shouldn't still be making them. But on the other hand, it still gave her enough, she was interested enough in them that she would continue to do them. So we do have a year of 93? Oh,
93,
so
there
right
we go.
when, oh my goodness.
So there really
okay.
is a kind
Yeah,
of
yeah.
reversal. Cool.
Any final thoughts from?
Betty would have more to say.
Yeah.
I'm sure she would.
That's a great point on which to leave it, I think.
Great,
Thank you
amazing.
so much.
Thank you all so much. Thank you all for being here.